it's Clarice. Honestly, I'm still trying to get used to talking to a camera. Again, I guess I'll just pretend that this is a person. So as I mentioned in my previous video, the main reason that I hadn't really been posting on BookTube is because I actually also hadn't been reading. Well, that's not totally accurate. I was still reading, but it wasn't very consistent. Like, if you looked at my overall reading for the year, it doesn't look so bad. Like, last year I still managed to read 32 books, and the year before that I still managed to read 16, which isn't super impressive compared to my previous reading, but I recognize that that's still a significant number of books. But if you look closer at like the month by month reading statistics, it paints a very different picture. Like, if you look at my month by month last year, there was a month I read like 11 books and a month where I read maybe like 8, but almost every other month I read 0 or just 1 book in the month. So you know that my reading comes from like this sudden urge, like sudden inspiration to read a lot in like 1 or 2 weeks, and not from a constant reading habit, which is fine, but I really did used to have that habit to read constantly and to pick up a book at least once a day, every day, and 2 or 3-ish years ago, that habit just suddenly went away. Though over the years, I did have many attempts to try to revive that habit again. Some successful for a short period of time, but for the most part, they weren't very successful at all. There was a time that I tried to get back into reading by listening to more audiobooks, just because I felt like that was maybe a less stressful way to get back into reading. I felt like listening to an audiobook was something I could do while doing other things, so maybe having a lack of time in my schedule would not be so much of an issue if that was the case. Like, I told myself, hey, it'll be great if I can listen to an audiobook while doing my chores or walking to work or like exercising or something. Sounds good in theory, but in practice it just didn't work out. First of all, I didn't really end up listening to audiobooks much while walking to work. And that's mainly because I live pretty near work. Now, for the most part, this is obviously a very lucky thing. I just take like 5 minutes to walk to work. But because my walk to work was so short, it didn't give me enough time to really get into an audiobook. You know, like listening to 5 minutes of an audiobook is kind of awkward. You usually get cut off at a weird point. And the same could be said for my chores, because it turns out that even though chores can seem like they take long while you're doing them, probably because they're boring, they may not actually take very long. And so in my case, I usually was just cleaning up after myself, and that didn't take up too much time. So again, similar to walking to work, it was just an awkward amount of time to listen to an audiobook, and it didn't really give me much time to get a good chunk of the book read. Well, listened to. And you could tell that I was being really idealistic and really aspirational when I told myself that I would listen to audiobooks while trying to exercise, because I don't really exercise. I'm not really good about doing that. I know that I should, but I don't. But I don't know why I thought it would be a good idea to, instead of just trying to get myself to read again, also try to get myself to exercise. Forcing 2 new habits at the same time is definitely not going to be easier than just trying to focus on this one. Clearly, I didn't think that one through. At one point last year, I also spent a lot of time reading comic books. That was the 1 month last year where I actually ended up reading 11 books. It's because they were all like graphic novels or comic book volumes. Honestly, at that point, I just read comics because I suddenly felt like it, you know, sudden inspiration to suddenly read more, specifically comic books at that time. But while I was reading those comic books, I did have an ulterior motive that maybe this could be the thing that could get me back into reading again. I thought maybe it could be a good transition from all the YouTube I'd been watching to just regular books, since comics also have a bit of a visual element to them. Well, a lot of a visual element to them. But what happened that month is I ended up binge reading some comic book series and then just abandoning them after that month again, and not really getting back into reading because of the comics. I guess my brain distinguishes my comic book reading mood from my normal book reading mood, and it's not necessarily the case that when I feel like reading comics, I feel like reading like books that are completely made out of words. Well, at one point I tried to figure out a good schedule to set aside for reading every day, because I figured maybe that was a good way to build a habit. If I associated a certain time of the day with reading, and then I did that pretty consistently, maybe I would just continue to read at that time without really much effort. So I figured I'd try to read before sleeping, because I figured that was the time that I was freest the most consistently. For several reasons, that didn't really work out. I remember trying to do this multiple times, times, but I don't know why I was so persistent about it when I kept experiencing the same issues over and over again. I remember there's some nights that I would go to bed and then I'd bring out my Kindle and start reading, but the words just wouldn't stick to my brain. You know, like sometimes when you're about to sleep, I guess your brain is not really in a place to really process much information, and I found myself having to read over the same paragraph over and over and over again because nothing was entering my brain. There are other nights still where I would get myself to read, but after a minute or two of reading, I'd start getting sleepy, and then I'd end up having to cut off my reading at like a weird point in the middle of a chapter, which I would end up having to repeat again anyway because I ended it in such a weird place. But the nights where my brain was able to focus and I wasn't sleepy, the problem was then the opposite, and I was suddenly way too awake. And I'd end up reading chapter after chapter after chapter and sleeping way too late and messing up my sleep schedule totally. So overall, reading before sleeping just led to really unpredictable results, except in the sense that all of those results were bad. Either I couldn't get myself to read or I would mess up my sleep schedule. I think at one point I also tried to reignite my passion for reading by watching more booktube videos, because maybe if I watched people excited about books, I would get more excited about books myself, or I would hear about more books that I'd be excited to read. But it turns out that booktube doesn't really motivate me to read. It's reading that motivates me to booktube. Those two variables didn't have the relationship that I wanted them to have. At one point, we even had a bit of a book club at work. Not where we all read the same book, but more where we sat down and would just talk about the books that we've been reading at the moment. And that gave me a very short spike of motivation. I remember when that book club happened, the next day I read through like half of a book just because it was a book that I wanted to share with them the next week. And then I never continued with the second half of the book. So that motivation was super short-lived. Now I think my reading habit is slightly back, not in full force like it was before, but reading is something that I end up doing in my free time now, and something I consider doing when I do have free time, and I consider that to be a win. But I don't think it was caused by anything I tried to do or anything within my control. I think it was just easier for me to suddenly decide that I was going to spend more time reading when all of the crazy stuff started happening in the world and my routine changed completely. And I think a sudden change of routine and a sudden change of surroundings does make it easier to sort of override the habits that you previously had. So yeah, here's to hoping that this habit sticks. Feel free to let me know in the comments how you usually try to get over a reading slump, or how you try to reignite a reading habit, or even like me, which attempts don't really seem to work for you. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye!